driving climate change initiatives and a move towards green energy and decarbonization that was really abandoned under the Trump administration. Announced today that he plans for the U.S. to cut emissions by at least half by 2030. That's a pretty ambitious plan. And again, we know that there's a climate meeting this week with the G20 nations, and this is a first step in reclaiming that leadership position. And I think that was a positive driver in the market today. Also, the Fed made clear, as the headline shows here, that it's not going to taper asset buying until 2023, which translates into what? If they're not going to taper asset buying, what does that mean for interest rates?
They're going to stay
They're
at
going to
lower.
stay
They're
low.
going to stay at zero.
Jason, that's exactly right. Andrew, too, with the backup voice there. Yeah, absolutely. It means that interest rates are going to stay low. And all of that's very positive. Whether you're looking to buy a home, that's going to dovetail directly into the housing sector. Whether you're looking to finance capital expenditures for your business, you can borrow at low rates. And all of that's very good. At the same time, as we're going to discover in the next couple of weeks, once we move on more comprehensively into foreign exchange, that when the global manager is facing what could be rising interest rates down the road, they certainly want to put in place the proper hedge protections to minimize what could be increasing cost if they financed with low rates, as many people are doing now. So that's what I think were two drivers in the market today. I'm sure that there were others if anybody wants to pipe in. Thank you, Andrew, for your comments. The rest of you, I'm going to move on from here. I'd like to take a review of where we were where we were the other day. We talked about the evolution of economic integration, focusing mostly on Europe. We looked at the evolution from a trade area to a monetary union. And we said that a free trade area like the U.S., like NAFTA, which includes the U.S., NAFTA, and which includes the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. What's the key factor here is that we see the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers among the member nations. So this is on a discriminatory basis. These few member nations see an elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. The next step in the path of economic integration is the customs union, where we see, in addition to the elimination of tariffs and NTBs, a common external policy, trade policy against non-members. The next step in the path of economic integration is a common market. Yes, we see not just an elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, a common external trade policy, but the free movement of goods, service, and other production factors, most importantly, labor, among the member nations. And of course, we referenced the EU in 1992 as a benchmark common market that we can refer to. Excuse me. Pardon me. The next step in the path of economic integration, we pointed out, was an economic union, where we see unified tax, monetary, and fiscal policy. What's the drawback of an economic union, which is the modern EU? Can anyone tell us?
What is the drawback? In what sense?
What's the real drawback to joining the economic union, the European Union? Think about the crisis.
The monetary.
Pardon me?
Isn't it the monetary system that all the people in the union have to have one currency, or someone, or they have their currency is controlled in
Right.
the economic union?
Well, I think that you're on the right track. Think about in 2008 during the Great Recession, and the countries in Europe that weren't able to devalue their currency. Why weren't they able to devalue their currencies? Because it's against the rules, and they all share a common currency. And because joining the union meant that they had to relinquish some of their economic sovereignty to the membership.
Yes.
Okay. In other words, member states can't devalue their currencies in the face of a crisis. So Iceland, which had not joined the euro in 2008, was able to devalue its currency because, again, not being a member of the union, hadn't relinquished any of its economic sovereignty, and was able to avoid some of the catastrophic cuts that had to be made in countries like Ireland and Greece and Portugal. That ultimately had to be rescued with an extensive package from the EU, along with support from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The final step in the path of economic integration is, of course, monetary union. And the United States is an example of that. This requires the unification of monetary, fiscal, social policies, and of course, a common currency. So on an exam, if I asked you what was the most evolved type of economic integration, the answer would be a monetary union. Okay. Are there any questions here before we move on with our review? Okay, good. So we talked about.
Professor. Oh, I think it's the next slide. I saw it. Could you clarify what is non-discriminatory
It
tariff?
means that if you're in the World Trade Organization and there's tariff reductions between you and a member nation, then all of those those reductions have to be extended to all other member nations. So you think of something like the World Trade Organization. On a discriminatory basis, you've got tariff reductions are limited just to the member nations. So it's NAFTA, where you have the US, Canada, and Mexico all enjoying those elimination of tariffs and NTBs. Again, on a non-discriminatory basis, if you and I are a member of a 10-nation regional trading relationship and we eliminate tariffs and NTBs between each other, it has to be shared by all the other members of the group. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, so we talked about economic integration on a discriminatory, non-discriminatory basis, and again, emphasizing the path of Western Europe since the end of World War II, which has been to embrace trade liberalization and the idea that trade leads to not only an increase in markets, but it leads to a strengthening of economic and, of course, social reforms, market reforms, strengthening the forces for reform, and that a common market based on single uniform regulations would be better than a collection of nations independent with their own separate currencies, and have worked since the end of World War II with the formation of GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade that we talked about the other night, towards what has become the economic union that we see today. We then talked about regional trading relationships, where we said multilateral trading relationships. We saw the reciprocal reduction of trade barriers on a non-discriminatory basis, or like the World Trade Organization, or regional trading relationships like NAFTA. We have the small group of nations that lower trade barriers that can't be enjoyed by any non-member nations. We also talked about the motivation for regionalism. Why do countries do it? Think about it, that the economic benefits of membership grow the bigger the group becomes. Yes, and so as the size of the market grows, being part of the regional trading relationship is incentivized, and non-member nations are encouraged to join so that they can enjoy the same benefits of all the other nations that are members, like the European Union. So we pointed out here that reasons for regionalism include, of course, growth, scale economies, the ability to develop comparative advantages, to refine specialization, to exchange knowledge among nations, to attract direct foreign investment, which is a major reason for regionalism, and finally, to strengthen the forces for reform, and not just economic reform, but social reforms, including such things as especially labor reform that affects workers all over the world. Next, we went through quickly the path of economic integration in Europe, and we looked at the end of World War II, and we see that the European community was formed with Benelux, which was Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg in 1948. And then we see there were two key agreements in the 1950s, the Treaty of Paris and the Treaty of Rome. The Treaty of Paris created the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community. What was the real reason for the ECSC? Because the nations that survived World War II intact wanted to make sure that no single nation could ever accumulate so many arms where they would be able to launch war on all of the other nations within the group. And so this, as we pointed out, provided a key framework for what eventually becomes the European Union. So we had the Treaty of Paris in 51, and in 1957 we see the same group, which is Benelux plus 3, France, Germany, and Italy, signing the Treaty of Rome, where the ECSC becomes a 6-nation trading bloc deemed the European Union, and the goal again is trade liberalization across the continent. And between 1957 and 1992, when it becomes a 19-nation common market, that's exactly what we see, are continued efforts to further the integration in Western Europe. So in 1968, we see a free trade area established. That free trade area becomes a customs union in 1970. In 1971, we pointed out the important date because why? The gold standard was suspended by President Nixon, and we see that foreign exchange begins to float in 1973 with the Great British Pound. By 1985, there is a formal timetable program to become a common market and called for the elimination of all non-tariff barriers by 92. The third major treaty that we talked about was the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 that creates the modern EU, the 19-nation common market, setting 2002 for the date of monetary union, when in fact the euro was introduced. And the Maastricht Treaty established the EU Growth and Stability Pact, which introduces the idea of convergence criteria, which is what nations need to do in order to join the European Union. And those included things, and I point out here, on price stability, low long-term interest rates, on deficit spending, and of course, stable exchange rates, where the country isn't allowed to devalue their currency for 2 years before they join the European Union. And what finally happens in 2002 is that the euro is introduced, and we have the European Central Bank, to which individual countries' autonomy has been relinquished with regard to the currency. So the ECB, which is based out of Belgium, controls the euro supply, the supply of euros, short-term interest rates, fixed foreign exchange rates for all of the member nations. So there's a lot to gain to be a member of the European Union: access to markets, huge markets, elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, knowledge exchange, scale economy, so on and so forth. But in the case of an emergency, of a financial emergency, a real financial crisis, the 2008 Great Recession revealed the weaknesses of the European Union, which is what? That you have a currency union, but you don't have a fiscal union. Yes? So we then went on and we talked about the welfare effects of regional trading relationships, and we said that there are really two of them. There's a trade creation effect, and there's the trade diversion effect. Increasing welfare through the trade creation effect suggests what? That the higher priced goods of a member within the regional trading relationship are replaced by a lower, another nation's lower cost goods within the regional trading relationship. The trade diversion effect just says that imports from a low cost outsider nation are replaced by a higher cost insider nation. So in the example that we looked at the other day, the US was displaced as a provider of wheat to Luxembourg by Germany, even though Germany's price was lower than the global world price of the US. We then moved off of the static or one-time effects of regional trading relationships. We talked about the longer-term effects, the dynamic effects of regional trading relationships that include things like access to creation of larger markets, greater factor efficiencies as a result of greater competition, and of course, the mutual elimination of trade barriers and the opportunity to strengthen the forces of reform that we talked about. We listed some of the dynamic welfare gains and from economies of scale to increased productivity, accelerated technical process, DFI, and again, greater competition. And finally, looking at our example of the customs union, what did we see? We saw that at free trade, Luxembourg, a price taker nation, was a buyer of US grain. We saw that with the imposition of a 50 cent a bushel tariff, that the US was still the supplier of choice, but the price went from $3 to $3.50. Finally, we see that the small nation Luxembourg formed a customs union with Germany. And Germany, which was the next lowest supplier after the US at $3.25 a bushel, becomes the new low-cost supplier. So of course, there's positive welfare effects. There's the production effect, and We have the production effect and the consumption effect. But of course, there's also the negative welfare effect of a trade diversion, because the low-cost supply, the low-cost world supply, the U.S. has been displaced by the next low-cost supplier, which in this case is Germany at $3.25 a bushel. And so we then went about plotting the welfare effects, and we said, with the customs union formed, what happens? We saw that we went from a demand of 23 bushels to a demand of 17 bushels under the tariff, which increases to 20 bushels once the customs union is formed. And we see that we have the protection effect is A, the consumption effect is B, and trade diversion is C. We said that if the trade creation effects, the positive welfare effects, the production effect plus the consumption effect, are greater than the trade diversion effect, then that means what? That there's been a welfare gain. If A plus B is the same as C, the trade diversion effect, well, then of course there's been no change in welfare. If it's less than the trade diversion effect, the combination of the two welfare effects, the production effect and consumption effect, then of course that signals that there's been a welfare loss. Just pardon me for a second as I gather some notes. And remember, again, the bigger the union, the bigger the opportunity, because the bigger the market becomes, and therefore, of course, the more attractive it is. Okay, so are there any questions on this?
So, Professor, just from my understanding, so the country that it's gonna export, it's still U.S., but it's at a higher level, right? At
No,
a higher price.
No, in other words, the U.S. can supply $3 a bushel. Germany can supply $3.25, right? Well, there's after the initial free trade begins, Luxembourg imposes a 50-cent tariff that increases the price of both Germany and the U.S. supply by 50 cents. So it increases to $3.50 and $3.75. But then Luxembourg forms an agreement, a partnership, a customs union with Germany. Germany is no longer subject to the tariff. Excuse me. Germany's no longer subject to the tariff, and therefore their price sets the base. So their price is $3.25, which is less than the $3.50 that would cost if you were importing from the U.S., which is subject to the tariff. You see, so what's happened now is that the supplier of choice becomes Germany, but it still represents trade diversion because the lowest cost producer, the lowest cost world producer, the U.S., has been displaced, has been boxed out by Germany, which is in the union, but the U.S. isn't. Does that help?
Oh yeah, it does help a lot. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk about variable levies. Okay, so here we look at the wheat market for demand and supply for the EU. All that the variable levy means is that depending upon what the market price is, the levy either goes up or the levy goes down. This is, of course, much more restrictive than a regular, just straight old tariff. Why? Because it means that no matter how low the supplier makes his or her price, the tariff is going to rise to a level that ensures that the price that the government wants to be achieved is going to be achieved. So let's look here. We see that under free trade, the world supply price is $3.50 a bushel, at which point the demand is 9 bushels, the supply is 3 bushels, and the imports are 6 bushels. Now, the levy is determined via a sliding scale every day, and it's the difference between the lowest world market price and the support price. Next, you see that, as I said, it's more restrictive than a fixed tariff. Why? It discourages foreign producers from absorbing part of the tariff for exactly the reason we just said, because price cuts trigger higher variable levies. Okay? So we see that if a tariff is imposed here, the EU sets a guaranteed price of $4.50 a bushel, imposing a tariff or levy of $1 a bushel. So what happens? We know that what's going to happen. Domestic production is going to increase. Here it increases from 3 to 5 million. And overall demand, we know it's going to fall because of the higher guaranteed price from 9 million to 7 million. And imports are going to shrink from 6 million to 2 million, right? So what happens now if the world price falls to 250? Well, then the import tariff rises to $2 a bushel, and the support price of 450 is going to be maintained. Are there any questions here? It's very straightforward. It's just a tariff that goes up or down, varies depending upon what the world price is.
Professor, can you repeat again what you said about okay, so here this says the difference between lowest world price market support price. So it's between 450 and 350, right?
What we're saying is that free trade, I'm telling you that at time zero, the world price is 350 a bushel. That's free trade, right?
Yes.
You see that, okay? At which point the demand is 9 million, the supply of the EU is 3 million, the rest is being imported into the EU. So with a tariff imposed of $1 a bushel, because the EU, excuse me, just hold on everyone for 1 second. Sorry about that, folks. We've got some marching tonight in my neighborhood, so I just wanted to close my windows. So getting back to the explanation. So at free trade, we're at 350 a bushel, right? So the EU wants to guarantee to its wheat farmers a price of 450 a bushel. So it tacks on $1 to the world price, $1 tariff. Well, if the price is then lowered to 250, what does that mean? It just means that the tariff is going to rise, and it changes every day. And so what it does is it discourages foreign producers from trying to get around those tariffs. Does that help?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Okay,
So basically, the import price is fixed at 450 at any time, regardless
exactly
of what
right.
the world price is.
That's exactly right. Thank you for saying that. You articulated that very well. You hear that, Maria? The import price is fixed. It's not going to change. Whether you, the exporter, lowers your price to nothing, if you lower it to $1, it's going to the tariff will be 350. Okay, very well said. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about a common currency. What are the advantages? Well, obviously, you've eliminated exchange rate fluctuations between the nations, and that, of course, elimination of volatility can be a very good thing. National economies are more insulated from any type of monetary disturbance or speculation as a result of having a common currency, and the political pressure for trade protection is reduced when everybody shares the same currency. One of the big disadvantages, we've identified that as being the loss of key domestic monetary policy tools, the ability to raise and lower interest rates and the ability to devalue your currency so that the normal exchange rate mechanisms are not available to counter macro shocks in the event of a crisis, as we saw during the Great Recession. You can't use inflation to reduce public debt, where rising interest rates will reduce the cost of public debt in real terms. And finally, we know that moving from multiple to single currency can trigger speculative attacks. I don't know if you're aware, if any of you are aware of it, but of course, George Soros is a world famous money manager and investor. When the euro was introduced, he made a run on the Great British Pound. He had made a run on the Great British Pound, and famously made $1 billion in the course of a day, speculating on the currency, making a speculative attack on the currency. This happened many years ago, as I said, and was undertaken by George Soros, which stands out as one of the most notorious attacks on a domestic currency in recent memory. One of the things that comes up is about the common agricultural policy that we see in the EU, Well, we know that it cuts restrictions on agricultural products traded internally. And so price supports are maintained and variable levies, tariffs are applied to agricultural products that are entering the European Union. What is the downside of all these price guarantees? What does it encourage?
You said, can you repeat the
What is
question?
the downside of all of these price supports?
Comparative?
It incentivizes people to over leverage.
It incentivizes farmers to overproduce.
Mm.
It incentivizes farmers to overproduce. So in the US, if you can't sell your sugar, the US guarantees you 22 cents a pound. In the EU, the governments provide enormous price supports for a host of agricultural products that encourages both efficient and inefficient production to exploit those price supports. And that's a major issue. So with export subsidy, as you said, it incentivizes production surplus, guaranteeing higher income for farmers, and of course, is very controversial. The argument being that there are some farmers that are much more efficient than other farmers, and the price supports are not consistent between nations, and therefore there is an unfairness to the common agricultural policy. But nevertheless, it remains in place. Are there any questions here about the common currency? Okay, so let's talk about the theory of an optimum currency area. You know, whether an area is better off with a single official currency like the European Union, right? And so we say that what's good about common currency? Well, it promotes price stability, labor mobility, lower transaction costs. As we said, it eliminates foreign exchange risk. It certainly improves certainty for investors. If I'm investing in France and Germany, it's much easier to use the euro than the German mark and the French franc, or the Spanish peso. It leads to enhanced competition, as we've talked about, generated by the very virtue of the fact that it's a regional trading relationship, and of course, increased economic efficiency because greater competition forces operators to it forces producers to fine-tune their operating strategies and deploy their capital wisely. Pardon me. And so, what are the benefits? These are the benefits versus the downside loss of independent monetary policy tools and exchange rate flexibility with regard to interest rates for your currency. That's the cost of joining an optimum currency area like the European Union. We know that successful integration among nations is more likely if what? Member nations have similar business cycles and economic structures. Monetary policy is going to affect all member nations in the same manner. Now, we know, just going back to the Great Recession, that monetary policy of the European Central Bank did not affect the wealthy northern nations of Western Europe in the same way that it affected poor southern nations in Europe. And that led to serious problems during the Great Recession in those countries that were suffering most, like Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. We know that successful integration, of course, is more likely if there are no legal, cultural, or language barriers to labor mobility. And finally, we know that integration is more likely if there's wage and price flexibility throughout the optimum currency area. Well, is the EU then an optimum currency area? That's the question that we ask ourselves. Well, even though it's tried to build a common market with uniform policies, there are lots of regulatory differences that exist among the nation states, the member states. There's also an inconsistency in the delivery of justice, in administration, which is regulation, in tax policies, and of course, in the control of corruption, which differs from state to state or nation to nation within the European Union. So, as we say here, persistent regulatory differences between national markets that adversely affect business expansion plans to Europe and create barriers to travel and investment. And again, the quality of justice, tax collection, administrative or regulatory performance, and corruption control is inconsistent among the nations, which are obstacles to greater integration. What is the solution for the European Union? The only possible solution for the European Union is greater integration, because without greater integration, what will happen? They'll fracture, as we've seen now under Brexit. So that seems to be the only possible answer. If we turn our attention to NAFTA, well, do you consider NAFTA an optimum currency area? Remember, there's no common currency among the three member nations, but there's a strong degree of economic integration between them because each one is a stable, advanced industrial economy. So in other words, they have similar economic structures. And the general feeling is that it's, while not sharing a currency, it reflects elements of the ideal optimum currency area. Are there any questions here?
Yes.
What make them different?
Hmm?
Why not? Why one is stronger than the other one? Can you elaborate a little bit more with integration?
Well, sure. In other words, are there language differences and cultural differences that persist, legal, cultural language differences that persist among the Euro member nations? Yes, there are, because the languages are different, the cultures are very different. And so, yes, there are challenges to labor mobility and further integration. Well, not so much labor mobility, but further integration among the citizens of the member states. That's been one of the things we've seen resisted in Europe. We know that monetary policy does not affect all the nations in the same manner, because a strong euro affects France in one way, it affects a poor nation like Greece in another way when the euro is very strong. Yes, because in that scenario, Greece can't afford the same strong euro that France or Germany can afford. In terms of wage and price flexibility, well, that doesn't really exist so much within the EU. And one of the things that needs to be addressed if the EU is going to continue to exist, continue to flourish, because labor laws are very restrictive, particularly in France. It's very hard to fire a person. It's very hard for companies to adjust their employee roles during a crisis. And it's one of the reasons why some American companies, Hewlett-Packard being the one that comes to mind first, that have established subsidiaries within a country like France and have left after a few years, because during times of slower business, when they wanted to trim their labor force, they weren't able to because of the very restrictive labor laws that exist in France and in other Western European countries. And so what's the EU takeaway? Well, it's that the euro eliminated exchange rate volatility. Yes, it provided access to huge flows of capital, right? And unified the European market. But what did it do? It fostered a false sense of security among private investors and unleashed huge unsustainable capital flows throughout Europe. Banks and private investors were only too happy to lend money to Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, the belief being that if there was a problem, well, there's always the European Central Bank, one for all for one, that there is the same policy existing in Europe, which is a unified fiscal monetary policy as exists in the United States. And as we found out in 2008, that's simply untrue. And we saw, we introduced a single currency without the type of institutional support that was necessary. So we saw that 2008 showed us that the EU lacked a centralized institution for fiscal policy coordination during a crisis. As I said earlier, what is the EU if not a currency union without a fiscal union? And that's very problematic. And so that's why I say that the only solution is deeper political and fiscal integration plus structural changes to the labor markets. Otherwise, we expect that we'll see greater fracture. And naturally, we haven't even talked about the geopolitical pressures, because China and Russia would like to do what with the EU? China and Russia would like to weaken the EU, particularly Russia. Why? Because
Neighbors.
broken. Because why?
They're competitors?
Because they're competitors, because a fractured EU is not as strong as a unified EU. Yes?
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly, just like NATO. A fractured NATO is not the same as a unified NATO, of course. And we've seen examples of that over the course of the last administration multiple times, where Russia has made clear its intent to weaken these supranational institutions, whether it's the World Trade Organization, as Trump helped during his term, the NAFTA, not NAFTA, NATO, and of course, the European Union. Now, if we look here at the countries of the European Union, the countries that are highlighted here, that are colored, Bulgaria, Croatia, so on and so forth, down to Sweden, those nations, what do they have in common? Does anyone know?
I think they've been added recently at the same time. Bulgaria, Croatia, and Romania were added lately. Prior to that was Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and maybe 2004 was Sweden and Denmark.
That's very good, Alec. Thank you. Yes, all recent members, but also all members that don't use the euro. And according to the Growth and Stability Pact of '92, the Maastricht Treaty, is that all EU members are legally obligated to adopt the euro by the end of 2022. And so that remains to be seen what that's going to look like a year and a half from now. But that's where we are in terms of those nations that are not yet using the euro, but are going to be compelled to. Okay, that's very good. Thank you, Alec. That was great. Let's turn our attention now to homework, chapter 8, if we can, chapter 8, number 6. Here, what do we get? We get the supply and demand for gloves in Portugal. Yes, we got the schedule. So all I did here was, excuse me, all I did here was I plotted, and you'll see I'm plotting each point. So all the points get plotted. So we have the supply of Portugal and the demand for Portugal. We're told that Germany and France can supply gloves at a price of $2 and $3 respectively. So here's the supply of France and the supply of Germany. So with free trade, we know what? Germany is going to be the supplier because they're the low-cost producer. So, right? So with free trade, we know that the quantity demand is going to be 14, the quantity supplied will be 4, and the imports will be 10 pairs of gloves. Now we say that suppose Portugal levies 100% non-discriminatory tariff on its glove imports. Well, that $2 becomes $4, right? And we see domestic production increase to 8 pairs of gloves. Domestic demand falls from 14 to 10 due to the higher price, and imports shrink to 2. If Portugal forms a customs union with France, well, France then becomes the low-cost supplier. So with France, the low-cost supplier, the quantity demanded is going to increase from 10 to 12. The quantity supplied is going to decrease from 8 to 6, and the quantity imported will increase from 2 to 6. And in the final case, suppose that instead Germany forms a customs union, that Portugal forms a customs union with Germany. Is this a trade diverting or trade creating customs union? Well, it has to be trade creating. Why? Because, well, there would be really no effect because hold on a second. Germany is a low-cost producer. So suppose with the trade creation effect, oh, this is the trade creation effect from the question before. I've gotten ahead of myself. So with the customs union formed with France, we know that you've got the production effect plus the consumption effect was A plus B equals 2, and the trade diversion effect was 2. That meant that there was no welfare change here because they're equal. The trade creation and trade diversion effect are equal. That means that there's no welfare change. It's a wash. Then the question asks, well, what about a customs union with Germany? Well, a customs union with Germany, the welfare of Portugal rises by an amount equal to the trade creation effect of A plus B, which is much larger here. It's $8. And as I point out, there's no trade diversion because Portugal's the global low-cost producer, so there would be no trade diversion. Okay? Are there any questions on this?
So,
Okay.
Professor,
Hi there, Maria. What's up?
in the question B, is Germany the one that is the lower price, right?
Right. Germany is a low-cost producer at $2 a share. France at $3 a share. So they're going to buy from Germany. There's your and we identify what free trade looks like with Germany as a low-cost supplier. Germany is now subject to a tariff of 100%. So the $2 becomes $4. So France would become $6. That would mean that under a tariff, Germany is still a low-cost producer at $4. But now, if Portugal forms a customs union with France, France then becomes the low-cost producer at $3, and we can plot the production effect, the consumption effect, and the trade diversion effect.
Okay.
But then, if they form the union with Germany, well, Germany was the original world low-cost producer. Well, then, therefore, there's not going to be any welfare loss because it's just all gain. Yes?
I see now.
Okay.
I was stuck on B. Okay, good.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you all very much. Okay, let's move on now to some hedging. Let's talk about some currency. Let's do a currency arbitrage example. Okay, so here we have just bear with me for a second, please. Here we have a currency pair, the dollar's trading against the Netherlands guilder and the dollar's trading against the Canadian dollar. We know that the calculated cross rate, Canadian dollar into the Netherlands Antilles guilder is what? Can someone tell me?
Should it be like 0.7 second?
How many times the
0.748?
Canadian dollar go into the Netherlands guilder? So it's 1.79 divided by 1.34 gets you 1.3358. So now the spot quote is higher, tells us that we have an arbitrage opportunity. And I'm telling you that in this case, the investor had 250,000 guilders. So what are they going to do? They're going to sell guilders for dollars, dollars for Canadian, and Canadian back into guilders. And if they do it correctly, they're going to have more money at the end than when they started. So we sell for, the guilders are worth 139,665 US dollar. Now we're going to sell those dollars for Canadian dollars. Well, that's going to multiply by 1.34. It's going to get us Canadian dollar 187,151. We've got to turn that back into guilders. So what we do is we say the 187,151 multiplied by the spot quote of 139 gets us 261.40. So what's our profit here? Our profit here is 10,140. We just divide that by the 179. We got the spot quote for the guilder against the dollar. The dollar against the guilder means that our profit is 5,665, which is approximately 4.1%. Does everybody understand that? I hope. I'm going to get out of that for just 1 second. Okay. I'll be right back. Okay, everybody. Let's talk about some administrative stuff. I'm going to have to end class early tonight because I have an engagement that I have to be at just a little while. So I want to talk to you about where we're going over the course of the next number of sessions. And then we're gonna call it a night. I'd like you to complete chapter 8 homework for Monday. Okay, you've already done the question number 6 with me. I'm going to post those slides, probably not tonight. I'll get the slides from tonight's class posted either late tonight or more than likely early tomorrow morning. So check Blackboard tomorrow morning for that. We're going to start chapter 9 next week, and we're going to talk about the multinational enterprise, different types of integration. We're going to talk about direct foreign investment, and we're going to talk about country risk before we move on to foreign exchange in chapter 11, expanding on our base of hedging techniques to include some more sophisticated tools. In our last 4 or 5 classes before the final exam on May 19th. In chapter 9, it's important that you mark this down. I only want you to read pages 295 to 308. On page 308 in the Carbo text, the section I want you to finish with is on joint ventures, international joint ventures, which is one of the pathways that companies use to invest abroad, to pursue direct foreign investment. And so again, chapter 9, pages 295 to 308 is what you're responsible for. So in addition to the homework chapter 8 for Monday, please read those 10 or 12 pages in chapter 9, and we're going to talk about that material next week before we move on to foreign exchange. Were there any other questions for me?
So chapter 8, you said all the questions?
In chapter 8, I'm pretty sure in chapter 8, there are 5 questions.
6, yeah, wait.
There are 6 questions. There are 6 questions, and I've given you you've done now one of them with me. So complete that, and then for international factor movements, the multinational and direct foreign investment, country risk. Like I said, you don't need to read the whole chapter, just 295 to 308, and that section that I'm asking you to focus on ends with international joint ventures. And beyond that, I remain available to you as needed. I'm going to wish everyone a good continuation, a safe continuation of your night and your days remaining in this week. A good weekend ahead, and I look forward to seeing you all again next Monday. Okay?
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.